When you think about history, what comes to mind? Kings, queens, big battles? Well, what if the most powerful character in a nation's story wasn't a person at all, but the land itself? Let's dive into how geography forged the destiny of ancient India.
So, how does that work? How can rocks and rivers write a nation's destiny? Well, in this explainer, we're going to see how the geography of the Indian subcontinent wasn't just some passive stage for history. No, it was an active force, dictating everything from farming and trade to the rise and fall of entire empires.
And our story, man, it starts a long, long time ago. We're talking a staggering 40 million years back. It all began with a violent geological collision that literally set the stage for everything that would come after, creating the Indian subcontinent as the unique place we know today.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, the birth of the subcontinent itself. Then we'll look at the monsoon's absolutely crucial role. After that, the mountains, how they were both walls and gateways. Then the rivers, the true cradles of civilization. And finally, we'll dig into the resources that forged entire empires.
Okay, let's kick things off with that incredible geological journey. I mean, to really get a grip on India's story, you have to go way back to a time when it wasn't even attached to Asia. It's a wild tale of continents drifting and then colliding.
So this slide kind of simplifies a process that took millions upon millions of years. Just try to picture it. You've got peninsular India breaking off from these ancient supercontinents, just drifting north across the ocean, and then bam, it crashes right into Asia. This wasn't just some little bump, though. It was a cosmic fender bender so powerful, it literally buckled the Earth's crust, forcing up the highest mountain range on the planet.
Right, so the Himalayas didn't just pop up overnight. Their rise was a slow, dramatic process, happening in at least 4 major phases. The most recent big uplift, that was during the Pleistocene epoch, roughly the last ice age. That actually makes them pretty young mountains, geologically speaking. And their creation was absolutely critical. Why? Because the rivers that flowed down from them carried tons of silt, and that silt formed the vast, incredibly fertile Indo-Gangetic plains, which would become the heartland of Indian civilization.
So that massive collision didn't just create mountains. It actually created a climate engine. And in this part of the world, that engine is driven by one powerful, life-giving force. You guessed it, the monsoon.
For many of us today, the monsoon might just mean getting ready for some heavy rain. But you have to understand, in ancient times, survival and prosperity was directly tied to its arrival. Before all our modern irrigation, the monsoon was literally everything. It was the deciding factor between a good harvest and a devastating famine. And what's so fascinating is that this weather pattern had this incredible dual role. On the one hand, the southwest monsoon brought the main rains needed for farming. But just as important, it filled the sails of ships coming to India from the Mediterranean. Then, like clockwork, the northeast monsoon would reverse the winds, allowing those same traders to sail back home. It was like this predictable natural engine for both food and international trade. So once sailors really figured out this wind pattern, which happened around the 1st century AD, it was like a superhighway just opened up across the Indian Ocean. I mean, think about it. Without that discovery, the huge-scale international trade that made ancient India so wealthy just wouldn't have been possible. It connected the subcontinent to Western Asia, the Mediterranean, and Southeast Asia in a reliable way for the very first time. Okay, so while the seas were connecting India to the rest of the world, its northern border was being defined by those massive mountains we just talked about, the Himalayas. And they served this really interesting dual purpose. So, on one hand, the Himalayas acted as this massive wall, almost like a climatic shield. They block the freezing Arctic winds blowing down from Siberia, and that's the reason northern India is so much warmer than other places at the same latitude. This giant wall also made a direct invasion from the north pretty much impossible in ancient time.
And this is so important, the wall wasn't impenetrable. The northwest, especially, was more like a filter than a solid barrier. It had these crucial corridors that allowed people to move back and forth for thousands of years.
Yeah, passes like the Khyber, the Bolan, and the Gomel. These were the gateways. Through these narrow passages came everyone, invaders, immigrants, traders, all bringing new goods, new cultures, and new ideas. It was this constant two-way street that made sure that even though India was protected, it was never ever truly isolated. All right, so if the mountains were the borders, then you have to think of the rivers as the highways. They were the very arteries of civilization, carrying life, commerce, and culture all throughout the land.
And when you look at the broad sweep of ancient history, you see this really clear pattern. Large-scale civilizations generally spread from the west to the east. It starts with the Harappans out in the Indus Valley. Then you have the Vedic culture in the western Gangetic Plains. And later, they pushed even further into the dense forests of the mid-Gangetic Basin.
So why this slow march to the east? Well, this table shows you exactly why. It all came down to technology versus the terrain. The western regions were drier, right? The soil was lighter, so you could clear it with tools made of stone and copper. But as you move east, the rainfall gets heavier, the forests get way denser, and the soil is harder. You just couldn't clear that kind of land until you had a much stronger tool. And that tool was iron. And, rivers were lifelines in literally every sense of the word. Long before roads, they were the main arteries for trade and communication. It's actually how the Emperor Ashoka was able to move his massive stone pillars all across the empire. They created fertile farmland, they acted as natural borders for kingdoms, and it's absolutely no coincidence that nearly every great ancient city, think Hastinapur, Varanasi, Pataliputra, was built right on the bank of a river. Okay, for our last section, let's dig a little deeper. Literally. Let's talk about the resources hidden in the earth. The metals and minerals under the soil were the raw materials for power, for technology, and for wealth. For a really long time, copper was king. It was mined in places like Khetri and used for all the early tools. But the real game changer, that was iron. Sourced from places like South Bihar, iron was just stronger and way more effective. It was the technological key that unlocked those dense eastern forests for farming, and its superiority in weapons helped fuel the rise of the very first great Indian empire in Magadha. And it wasn't just iron either. Having access to specific resources really shaped regional power. Like the Satavahana dynasty in Andhra, they had tons of lead. So what they do? They made lead coins. The early silver mines in Bihar supplied the metal for the subcontinent's very first coins. And while there was some local gold down in Karnataka, most of it actually came from trade, which explains why gold coins only became common when trade with the Roman Empire was really booming. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, this quote says it perfectly. While geography created all these distinct regions, the simple need for these resources tied them all together. No single area had everything it needed, and that necessity created this complex web of trade and interaction that connected the entire subcontinent right from the very beginning. So when you put it all together, from a continent drifting across an ocean, to seasonal winds powering global trade, to the location of a single copper mine shaping a kingdom, you start to see it. Geography wasn't just a stage for history, it was one of its main authors. The mountains, the rivers, the monsoons, they weren't just scenery, they were active players in the story. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. If India's past was so clearly forged by its geography, what lessons does its ancient map hold for its future? It's a powerful way to look at things, right? This deep connection between the land and destiny, it doesn't just help us understand the past, it might just give us a lens to view the present and the future.